She was stripped of her family name, robbed of her life's work, and exiled to a rotting cabin in the mountains just weeks before a deadly winter. They expected her to freeze, to beg for mercy. Instead, she rebuilt. When spring finally thawed the ice, her betrayers learned a terrifying lesson. The boardroom of Harding Logistics, towering 40 stories above downtown Seattle, was completely silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of Richard Harding's gold pen. Clara Harding, his daughter and the company's chief operations officer, stared at the documents slid across the polished mahogany table. Her vision blurred, the legal jargon swimming before her eyes, but the bottom line was unmistakably clear. She was being erased. Embezzlement, Clara. Richard's voice was devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the voice of a corporate executioner. $4 million funneled into offshore shell companies under your authorization. I didn't sign these, Clara said, her voice trembling not from fear, but from a sudden, violent realization. She looked across the table at Alaric, her fiancé of 3 years. Alaric, who was the company's lead financial auditor. Alaric, who refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at his expensive leather portfolio. The digital signatures match your credentials perfectly, Alaric said softly, finally looking up. The cold detachment in his blue eyes felt like a physical blow to her chest. The board has already voted, Clara. Your stepbrother, Gregory, will be assuming your duties effective immediately. Gregory, sitting to their father's right, offered a faint, sickening smirk. It was a coup, a meticulously planned slaughter of her career and her life. Clara had spent the last 10 years building Harding Logistics into a regional empire, working 80-hour weeks while Gregory squandered his trust fund in European casinos. Now, with the company preparing for a billion-dollar merger, they needed her equity, and they had found a way to take it. If you fight this or sign this, we go to the authorities, Richard stated, leaning forward, his eyes flat and merciless. You will face 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The press will crucify you. But because you are my daughter, I am offering you an out. You surrender your shares, sign the non-disclosure agreements, and leave the city today. In exchange, I won't press charges, and you can have the old property in the Bitterroot Mountains, the one your grandfather left behind. A single manila envelope was pushed toward her. Inside was a deed to a tract of land in remote Montana, a place Clara hadn't thought about since she was a child. It was a cruel, twisted joke. Winter was 3 weeks away. Clara looked at the men who had just dismantled her existence. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The absolute betrayal severed something deep inside her, replacing her panic with a strange, icy clarity. She picked up the pen, signed her name on the exit papers, took the manila envelope, and walked out of the glass-walled room without a backward glance. 48 hours later, Clara's sleek SUV was fighting its way up a treacherous, unpaved logging road in the Montana wilderness. The heater was blasting, but the chill of late November seeped through the glass. The sky above the towering pines was the color of bruised iron, heavy with the promise of early snow. She had $50 in cash, a trunk full of hurriedly purchased basic supplies, canned beans, a cheap sleeping bag, a flashlight, some bottled water, and the clothes on her back. Her bank accounts had been frozen by Alaric's legal maneuvering, pending internal investigation. When the GPS finally lost its signal, Clara navigated by the crude, hand-drawn map her grandfather had attached to the deed decades ago. The road narrowed into a rutted trail, forcing her to abandon the vehicle when a fallen Douglas fir blocked the path. She packed her supplies into a duffel bag, zipped her designer wool coat up to her chin, and began the 2-mile hike up the ridge. The silence of the woods was absolute, heavy, and oppressive. By the time she breached the clearing at the top of the ridge, her breath was coming in ragged, white plumes. She dropped the duffel bag. "No," she whispered. Her father hadn't given her a rustic retreat. He had given her a grave. The cabin was a rotting corpse of a building. The roof on the left side had completely caved in under the weight of previous winters. The porch was a jagged maw of splintered wood. There were no windows left, just gaping black holes staring out into the encroaching twilight. The stone chimney was partially collapsed, and a thick layer of wet, decaying leaves carpeted the interior floor. The wind howled through the structure, a haunting sound that seemed to mock her very existence. They hadn't just exiled her. They had sent her here to die. Richard knew her pride wouldn't let her crawl back and beg. He knew she had no money, no friends who would cross him, and nowhere else to go. As the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the iron sky, Clara stood in the ruins of her grandfather's legacy. She felt the crushing weight of despair pressing down on her shoulders. She could lay down in the snow. It would be easy. Just go to sleep. But then she pictured Gregory's smirk. She saw Alaric's cold, detached eyes. She saw her father's arrogant posture. A primal spark ignited in the darkness of her chest. It was a tiny, fragile flame of pure, unadulterated rage. Clara stepped over the threshold of the ruined cabin. "I will not die here," she said to the empty woods. The first night was a masterclass in suffering. Clara huddled in the only dry corner of the cabin, wrapped in her cheap sleeping bag, shivering so violently her teeth chipped. The temperature plummeted to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. She had managed to drag a rusted sheet of corrugated tin over the largest hole in the roof, but the wind still sliced through the cabin like invisible knives. When dawn broke, pale and grey, Clara was barely able to move her joints. The water in her plastic bottles was frozen solid. Panic, raw and suffocating, threatened to overtake her, but she shoved it down. Panic was a luxury for the rich. Survival required action. She spent the first 3 days in a state of frantic, brutal labor. Using a heavy rock and a rusted crowbar, she found half buried in the mud out back, she began tearing apart the collapsed section of the cabin to salvage the unbroken timber. Her manicured nails snapped and bled. Her palms blossomed with agonizing blisters that soon popped and turned into raw meat. She had to build a smaller, contained shelter within the ruins of the larger cabin, a room within a room to trap body heat. She dragged the salvaged logs, stacking them to seal off a 10 by 10 foot section around the intact fireplace. She stuffed the gaps with mud, pine needles, and dry moss, working until her muscles screamed and her vision tunneled. On the 4th day, the true test arrived. A massive blizzard, early for the season, slammed into the Bitterroot Mountains. The sky went white, and the wind shrieked like a dying animal. Clara was trapped in her small, sealed room. She managed to get a fire going in the stone hearth using dry twigs and a cheap plastic lighter, feeding it with pieces of the broken porch. As she sat by the flickering fire, eating cold baked beans straight from the tin, the wind suddenly tore away a loose floorboard near the hearth. Clara crawled over to fix it, hammering it down with her rock, when her hand brushed against something cold and metallic in the dirt beneath the floor joists. Heart pounding, she dug her bleeding fingers into the freezing dirt. She unearthed a heavy iron lockbox, sealed with wax and wrapped in decayed oilcloth. It took her an hour to smash the rusted lock open with the crowbar. When the lid finally creaked back, She gasped. It was a cache left by her grandfather, Wallace Harding. Wallace had been a formidable mountain man before he made his fortune in lumber, a man who despised the corporate monster his son Richard had become. Inside the box was a veritable treasure trove of survival. A heavy, forged carbon steel hunting knife, boxes of waterproof matches, 3 thick, pristine wool blankets, a medical kit, a spool of heavy-duty snare wire, and a leather-bound journal. Clara opened the journal. The first page was dated 30 years ago. To whoever finds this, hopefully, someone with the Harding blood, but none of the Harding greed. The mountain does not care about your bank account. It only respects grit. If you are reading this, winter is coming. Here is how you survive. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled down Clara's dirt-streaked face. It was the first time she had cried since the boardroom. She wasn't alone. Wallace had reached out from beyond the grave to catch her. The journal became her Bible. Over the next 3 weeks, as the snow piled 5 feet high outside, Wallace's meticulous notes taught her how to survive. She learned how to reinforce the chimney using river clay. She learned how to set wire snares in the snowbanks to catch snowshoe hares, providing her with vital protein when her canned food ran out. She learned how to boil pine needles for vitamin C to stave off scurvy. The pampered corporate executive was dead. In her place, a wild, hardened woman was being forged in the ice. Clara's designer clothes were soon replaced by layers of animal hides she tanned using the crude methods detailed in the journal, worn over her ragged wool coat. She lost 15 pounds, her cheekbones sharpening into blades, her eyes taking on a feral, hyper-aware gleam. But the mountain was not easily conquered. In mid-January, a sudden, brutal, deep freeze plunged the temperatures to 30 below zero. The cold was so intense that the sap in the pine trees outside literally exploded with loud cracks that sounded like rifle shots. Clara was rationing her firewood, sleeping right next to the hearth, heavily bundled in Wallace's wool blankets. On the 3rd night of the deep freeze, she heard it, a heavy, deliberate crunch of snow outside the patched window. Then a low, guttural huff of breath. Clara froze. She slowly reached out, wrapping her calloused hand around the carbon steel hunting knife. The makeshift wooden barricade she had nailed over the window frame suddenly groaned inward. A massive, starving cougar, driven mad by the freezing temperatures and lack of prey, was trying to force its way into the cabin, drawn by the smell of the hare Clara had roasted earlier. The barricade splintered. A massive paw, armed with 3-inch razor claws, swiped blindly into the room, knocking Clara's oil lantern to the floor. Darkness consumed the cabin, illuminated only by the dying red coals in the fireplace. The cougar let out a terrifying, ear-piercing scream, a sound like a woman being murdered, and thrust its heavy head through the gap. Its yellow eyes reflected the dying embers, wild and desperate. Clara didn't scream. 6 months ago, she would have fainted. Now, the adrenaline that flooded her veins was cold and focused. She was not prey. This was her home. She lunged forward, not away. As the cat tried to squeeze its shoulders through the tight gap, Clara brought the heavy crowbar down with both hands, smashing it directly onto the cougar's snout with a sickening crack. The beast roared in pain, thrashing wildly, its claws tearing through Clara's wool sleeve and carving a deep, bloody gash down her left forearm. The pain was searing, but Clara didn't back down. She dropped the crowbar, gripped the hunting knife, and thrust it forward, stabbing blindly at the animal's thick neck. The blade found purchase. The cougar shrieked, a chaotic flurry of fur and blood, before violently twisting backward, tearing itself free from the window frame and disappearing into the howling blizzard, leaving behind a trail of crimson on the snow. Clara collapsed against the wall, clutching her bleeding arm, her chest heaving. The wind howled through the broken barricade, bringing the deadly cold back into the room. She had to act fast. Gritting her teeth against the agony, she dragged a heavy wooden table over to block the window, wedging it tightly. She then opened her grandfather's medical kit. By the light of the rekindled fire, she cleaned the deep lacerations with alcohol, biting down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, and clumsily stitched the wound closed with a curved needle and silk thread. As she sat by the fire, her arm throbbing, wrapped in blood-stained wool, Clara looked at her reflection in the dark glass of a broken lantern. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. The socialite from Seattle was completely gone. The woman in the reflection had eyes like flint. She had fought the mountain. She had fought the beasts. And she had won. Winter was still raging, but Clara knew right then, with absolute certainty, that she was going to survive. And when the snow finally melted, she was going to turn her attention back to the people who put her here. They thought they had buried her. They didn't realize she was a seed. February bled into March, and the brutal grip of the Montana winter finally began to loosen. The deep, suffocating silence of the frozen woods was replaced by the chaotic symphony of the thaw. The sharp cracks of melting ice, the rushing roar of swollen creeks, and the return of birdsong. Inside the cabin, Clara Harding was undergoing a thaw of her own. The cougar attack had left her with a jagged, raised scar running from her elbow to her wrist, a brutal, beautiful testament to her survival. As her body healed, the final remnants of the Seattle corporate executive melted away. She was leaner, her muscles dense and hard from months of chopping wood and hauling water. Her skin was tanned by the harsh winter sun and wind, and her eyes held the calm, dangerous stillness of an apex predator. With the worst of the cold behind her, Clara turned her attention to the ruins of her grandfather's cabin. She was no longer just surviving. She was reclaiming her territory. The journal Wallace had left behind was more than a survival guide. It was a blueprint. Her grandfather had documented exactly how he had felled the timber and laid the foundation 50 years prior. Armed with the carbon steel tools she found buried in a rusted shed beneath a snowbank, a broad axe, a hand saw, and a massive sledgehammer, Clara went to work. From dawn until dusk, she stripped away the rotting wood of the collapsed roof. She felled young lodgepole pines, dragging them up the ridge with a crude harness she fashioned from deer hide and heavy rope. It was agonizing, back-breaking labor. There were days she collapsed in the mud, sobbing from pure physical exhaustion, but the memory of Alaric's cold eyes and Gregory's smirk always forced her back to her feet. She rebuilt the roof joists, securing them with wooden pegs she carved by hand. She patched the massive hole in the wall, matching the interlocking notches perfectly. She gathered smooth river stones from the creek, mixing thick mud and clay to rebuild the crumbled chimney into a towering, sturdy structure. Finally, using a mixture of rendered animal fat and pine pitch, she sealed the logs, turning the weathered grey wood into a rich, glowing amber. By late April, the rotting corpse of a building had been resurrected. It was no longer a ruin. It was a fortress. It stood proud and defiant against the mountain backdrop, a stunning piece of off-grid architecture completely unrecognizable from the death trap her father had sent her to. But the most critical discovery did not happen during the construction. It happened in the quiet hours of a rainy spring evening, while Clara was studying the final pages of Wallace's journal. The leather binding at the back of the book felt unusually thick. Tracing her thumbs along the seam, Clara found a hidden slit. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully pulled a folded, yellowed document from the secret compartment. It wasn't a survival note. It was a geological survey and a legal deed. Clara read the documents by the light of the fire, her eyes widening with every paragraph. The 40 acres her father had exiled her to did not just contain a worthless cabin. Wallace had secured the exclusive water and mineral rights to the massive, subterranean aquifer sitting directly beneath the mountain, an aquifer that fed the entire valley below. Suddenly, the pieces of the corporate puzzle snapped together with terrifying clarity. Harding Logistics wasn't just merging with a shipping competitor. The billion-dollar deal they were brokering involved selling vast tracts of valley land to a global tech conglomerate to build the country's largest server farm. A data center of that magnitude required millions of gallons of fresh, cold water daily for its cooling systems. Richard didn't exile her just to steal her shares. He exiled her to a death trap because the aquifer rights were locked in a trust that only transferred to the company upon Clara's death, or if the land was legally declared abandoned. By forcing her out right before winter, he had signed her death warrant to secure a billion-dollar payday. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed. Clara stared at the deed, the signature of her grandfather, a bold declaration of war. Her father had underestimated her. He thought the mountain would break her. Instead, the mountain had handed her the very weapon she needed to destroy him. The second week of May brought a brilliant, cloudless sky to the Bitterroot Mountains. The logging road, previously impassable, was finally dry enough to handle heavy vehicles. A convoy of 3 black luxury SUVs and a yellow county bulldozer rumbled up the winding dirt path, crushing fresh spring wildflowers beneath heavy tires. In the lead vehicle, Gregory Harding sat in the passenger seat, aggressively complaining about the lack of cell service, while Alaric stared nervously out the window, obsessively checking his Rolex. "I still don't understand why we had to come up here personally," Gregory whined, adjusting the collar of his designer trench coat. "Because the tech conglomerate's lawyers demand visual confirmation that the property is uninhabited, and the structures are condemned before they sign the aquifer lease," Alaric replied, his voice tight. "We file the abandonment paperwork today. We bulldoze whatever is left of that shack, and the merger closes on Friday. Do you think—" Alaric swallowed hard. "Do you think we'll find a body?" Gregory let out a sharp, callous laugh. "If the winter didn't freeze her, the bears ate her. Clara was a boardroom shark, Artie. Out here, she was dog food. Now shut up and get the paperwork ready." The convoy breached the tree line and rolled into the clearing. The vehicles slammed on their brakes simultaneously. The bulldozer behind them ground to a screeching halt. Gregory's jaw dropped. Alaric's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. There was no rotting shack. There was no corpse. Standing in the center of the clearing was a beautifully restored timber cabin, its rich, oiled logs gleaming in the spring sun. The roof was flawless, the porch was sturdy and wide, and a steady, welcoming stream of smoke curled from the perfectly reconstructed stone chimney. And standing on the porch, leaning casually against a thick wooden support beam, was Clara. She wore a heavy canvas jacket over a handmade deer-hide shirt, her dark hair braided tightly down her back. A hunting rifle was slung effortlessly over her shoulder, and the massive, jagged cougar scar was proudly visible on her exposed forearm. She looked like a wilderness goddess, feral, unbothered, and utterly lethal. Gregory scrambled out of the SUV, nearly tripping in the mud. What is this? How are you alive? Hello, Gregory, Clara said, her voice carrying across the clearing. It lacked the frantic stress of her corporate days. It was smooth, deep, and dangerous. Alaric, you're looking a little pale. Alaric stumbled out of the car, clutching his leather briefcase to his chest as if it could protect him. Clara, my God. Sheriff Miles, Gregory suddenly yelled, turning to the third SUV as a local county sheriff stepped out, looking confused. She's squatting. This land is company property. I want her arrested and removed immediately so we can demolish this structure. Sheriff Miles, a sturdy man with silver hair, tipped his hat back and looked at the beautiful cabin. Doesn't look like squatting to me, son. Looks like a homestead. I don't care what it looks like, Gregory shrieked, his pristine composure completely shattered. Tear it down! I'm afraid he can't do that, Gregory, a new voice echoed from the side of the cabin. From around the corner stepped Samuel Bennett, a towering, ruthless environmental attorney from Helena, whom Clara had hiked 30 miles to hire 3 weeks prior. He was holding a thick manila folder. According to the trust established by Wallace Harding, the deed to this land, and more importantly, the subterranean aquifer rights, belongs exclusively to Clara Harding, provided she maintains residence, Samuel said, stepping down from the porch, which she clearly has. Alaric dropped his briefcase. The metallic click echoed in the silent clearing. Furthermore, Samuel continued, his voice dripping with venom, Ms. Harding has provided my office with the original offshore routing numbers from her father's accounts. We handed them over to the FBI 3 days ago. As we speak, federal agents are raiding Harding Logistics in Seattle. Your father is already in custody. Gregory stumbled backward, hitting the side of the SUV. No, that's impossible. We locked you out. You had no internet, no phone. I had my grandfather's journal, Clara said, walking slowly down the porch stairs. She unslung the rifle and held it loosely by her side. And I had all winter to think. She stopped a few feet from Alaric. He couldn't meet her eyes. He was trembling violently. Clara, please, Alaric whispered, tears welling in his eyes. They made me do it. Richard threatened to fire me. I never wanted this. Clara looked at the man she almost married. She felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no betrayal. The mountain had burned all her weaknesses away. You should leave, Alaric, she said softly. The drive down the mountain is steep, and the feds will be waiting at the bottom. Sheriff Miles stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Gregory's shoulder. I think it's time you boys turn these cars around. You're trespassing on private property. Gregory didn't argue. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and saw the monster his family had inadvertently created. He scrambled into the driver's seat, abandoning Alaric, who had to run to the second SUV to escape. As the vehicles sped away, kicking up mud in a desperate retreat, Clara stood in the clearing and took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented mountain air. The bulldozers were gone. The betrayers were vanquished. The silence of the forest returned. But this time it wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was peaceful. She turned back to look at her cabin. She had been sent here to die, a forgotten woman in a rotting grave. But she had survived the winter, and now the mountain was hers. Did Clara's incredible transformation and brutal revenge satisfy you? The wilderness doesn't forgive, but it empowers those with the grit to survive. If you loved this intense story of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of human resilience. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories where the underdogs rise from the ashes. See you in the next one.